Falun Gong in China. And so, in addition to what we normally do, which is look at that persecution and try and expose it to the world, we're also taking a look at those 25 years and looking at some of the more impactful trends, some of the more disturbing lessons that we've learned in this persecution. And emerging from this quarter-century persecution, one thing that's been very disturbing is the coverage or lack thereof in the Western press of the Falun Gong human rights abuses in China. And at the center of that problem, really, unfortunately, is the paper of record, the New York Times. And so we did a deep dive into their coverage, the kind of things they were looking at, stuff they missed, because it played an enormous role in maligning Falun Gong really worldwide and completely obscuring, sometimes completely missing what was happening in China. And we thought that is not only an important thing for the Falun Gong community, but it's really important beyond the Falun Gong community to look at what happened there. Why was this journalism so off the mark, and what could we learn?
On that note, why was it so off the mark? Did the New York Times change the way they covered it, or what exactly was the root issue here?
Well, what we saw is the New York Times was pretty much off the mark from the very beginning. And in fact, the first few years were among some of the more disturbing in terms of how they covered Falun Gong, the way they framed Falun Gong. And we contrast that really with some of the work of the other major media papers, particularly the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. So if you look at, for example, 1999 to like 2002, which was the first 3 years of the persecution, the Wall Street Journal was busy on a series of 10 articles that would win them the Pulitzer Prize for exposing the persecution of Falun Gong. The Washington Post had a series of groundbreaking articles where they were really the first ones that said, oh, you know, this persecution is really coming from the top man in the Chinese Communist Party at that time, Jiang Zemin. Or this persecution has torture as part of the mandate from Beijing. All that was uncovered by the Washington Post. So while these two papers are generating this sort of groundbreaking work, the New York Times coverage of Falun Gong, first of all, was taking the lead from the CCP itself in terms of how to frame Falun Gong, how to talk about Falun Gong. And worse yet, I mean, one of their, I would say, big events of those first few years is the publisher of the New York Times flew to China and met with Jiang Zemin, the leader of the CCP at that time, the man who had architected the persecution against Falun Gong, as the Washington Post had disclosed a year earlier. And so here was the leadership of the New York Times meeting with the leadership of the largest tyrannical communist regime on earth at a time when they were what many scholars and some lawyers call engaged in a genocide against Falun Gong. So those first few years were particularly disturbing if you look at what the New York Times was doing and not doing.
You mentioned, say, the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post and their critical coverage of these human rights abuses happening inside China, especially against the Falun Gong. Mm-hmm. What was the New York Times saying then? If they even met with Jiang Zemin, what were they saying when it came to Falun Gong?
Well, a few things I would point out. One is a really disturbing factual inaccuracy. And so in 1999, if you look at the coverage, including the New York Times, everybody was saying there's 70 to 100 million people practicing Falun Gong in China. And they're all referencing a government survey, which had come up with those numbers. Shortly after the persecution began, suddenly the New York Times, without explaining why the change or why it even differs from their own reporting just a few months ago, changed that number to 2 million. And said, oh, there's only 2 million Falun Gong in China. In addition to that, they then say, they sometimes reference the number 70 million, tens of millions, but then they change the source of that and say, oh, that's just claims by Falun Gong that no one can really substantiate. So it's very disturbing that they would not only get the facts wrong, they not only contradict their own reporting, but then they try to spin what was the real number and give it to a completely different source. So that's just one example of many, many examples where factual inaccuracies got into their reporting and propagated out from there.
Seems when we look at the coverage of Falun Gong by the New York Times, often you see the terms evil or cult, which sounds very similar to what the Chinese Communist Party calls it. What did you find out in terms of that, and maybe why the New York Times was towing that party line?
So that was another disturbing aspect because, yes, when the Chinese regime started the persecution of Falun Gong, they weren't using that term. They didn't really know what they were doing, and they sort of stumbled into a public relations nightmare. months later, after the persecution started, they realized, oh, we need to have an excuse to the world. So the regime started using that term, the cult term. And of course, a lot of the media were reporting on that they were using it. What's disturbing of what we found in the New York Times is they seem to really internalize that idea. And so in some of their reports, they're not using quotes or attributing it to the Chinese regime. They're saying it themselves in their own voice as fact. And so that was one of the more disturbing things that we found is not only were they following the CCP framing in terms of what is Falun Gong, what are the teachings, what are the beliefs, but they were internalizing it. It appeared from their reporting.
So it sounds like, as you're mentioning, this is a pretty ominous start to the New York Times coverage of Falun Gong. Has that changed since then in terms of their coverage?
Well, we looked at over almost 160 articles that came out from the New York Times from 1999 to the present day. And what we saw was really three phases. There was that first period where that was really disturbing in terms of how they were covering it. Then there was a period from about 2003 all the way through to really up to 2016, 2017, where there's virtually no coverage. There was one notable exception by a reporter there by the name of Andrew Jacobs, who did a quality piece on what was happening in China, but besides his work, virtually nothing. And so this is sort of this deafening and silent time period. This third time period, I would say, was sort of the last 6 or 7 years. The New York Times really has taken a very hostile tone to the Falun Gong diaspora around the world and affiliated organizations. They seem to be on the attack, where they're not only regurgitating the old CCP framing in terms of the character of Falun Gong and what we're doing, but they've upped the ante a little bit, and it's gotten more hostile and more attuned to kind of hot button issues in the West in terms of trying to convince, it seems, their readership that there's something really wrong with Falun Gong and they're not to be trusted, as opposed to there are still tens of millions of people in China being violently persecuted, and that's really a real story. They take not only the original CCP framing of Falun Gong, but they're sort of attuning it to the Western world. I want to give you an example. One of the recent New York Times pieces that was covering, I think it might have been the Epoch Times, but they made a lot of reference to Falun Gong, and one of the references they cited is that Falun Gong is racist because it prohibits interracial marriage. Now, this is important because this is a propaganda talking point that Beijing put out at about 2009, 2010. Notably, they only put this propaganda out in the West, where they know that talking point is a pertinent issue. It's not in the propaganda against Falun Gong domestically inside China. Also notably, it's demonstrably false. If you go into any Falun Gong community here in the United States, around the world, there's interracial marriage, interracial children. It's completely a non-issue. It's totally fabricated. But the New York Times sought to sort of cite that, as they do other sort of unsubstantiated or demonstrably false things, to kind of paint an entire picture that Falun Gong is somehow strange and weird and extreme. And so they've taken the cult narrative that was domestic in China from 20 years ago, and they've updated it. And they seem to have weaponized it to try and go against Falun Gong and Falun Gong related initiatives here in the United States and around the world.
Aside, if you will, to Beijing, to the point that they're trying to get their propaganda into the biggest media in America?
Well, if you look, Falun Gong really is a third rail issue in China, and there are a couple reasons for that have evolved. For the first few years, it was the third rail issue because the top man in the country, Jiang Zemin, who was the chairman of the Communist Party, personally mandated it. This is what the Washington Post uncovered early on. And so it's very clear that anybody who cares about their political career or even their business is going to toe that party line. So that's why Falun Gong was really the third rail issue for the first few years. But over time, Falun Gong inside China has developed a massive grassroots network that is peacefully yet determinedly exposing the CCP to their neighbors, their friends, and everybody. So it's become this tremendously potent voice for exposing the CCP crimes to the people of China. The Falun Gong diaspora is a similar story, where it is, if you look at the Falun Gong projects and initiatives and affiliate organizations around the world, they represent a huge voice in warning the world, not just about the persecution that we have faced, Falun Gong has faced in China, but the threat of the CCP globally. And I think now Falun Gong remains a third rail issue because in the CCP's mind, it's an existential threat. It's one of the strongest voices, one of the most visible actors on the world stage, exposing their dirty laundry, and that's something they don't want to see. So it really is a third rail issue. And then the question becomes, well, if it's a third rail issue for the CCP, why does it seem to be somewhat of that for the New York Times? There's a convergence there of goals that I think is very troubling.
So you mentioned earlier with the New York Times head traveling over and meeting Jiang Zemin right in the midst of this persecution. The Epoch Times article dives into the vested interests of the New York Times, whether that's money or setting up more bureaus inside China as a potential reason why we're seeing that. But switching gears a little bit, right now, if you look at a lot of headlines, the Uyghurs or the ethnic minority group are dominating headlines. What have you found in terms of how the New York Times covers the Uyghurs compared to, say, the Falun Gong?
We get that question a lot, and actually we delve into that into some length in the report, because if you look at, let's just look at three different groups in China that we know are being horrifically persecuted: Falun Gong, Uyghurs, and Tibetans. Well, if you look at Uyghurs and Tibetans, they get a significant amount of coverage in China from the New York Times. So clearly it looks like the New York Times is dedicated to exposing human rights abuses in China. But with Falun Gong, it's very, very different. It's treated as a third rail issue for the New York Times as well. So why is that? Well, there's a few things that we point out in the report. One is there tends to be, or there seems to be, a pattern of secular bias at the New York Times, whereas Uyghurs and Tibetans are ethnic minorities. Falun Gong really is only defined as a faith group. So that's one picture. And I think the other thing we have to look at is, again, from the CCP's perspective, exposing the human rights abuses of the Uyghurs and Tibetans is annoyance. They obviously don't want that, but it doesn't represent a significant threat, whereas Falun Gong is the Chinese people. You can't separate Falun Gong. I mean, 70 to 100 million people among the Han Chinese throughout China. And so it's really a third rail issue for them. And so anybody who's interested in keeping in good graces with the Chinese government, with not getting kicked out of the country, or at least maintaining some sort of access, because I know a lot of the media over the years, they get kicked out, they'd be invited back in, it's a back and forth. Anybody who's interested in trying to maintain some access to China has to stay away from the Falun Gong issue, and that must be coming into play. And just to give you an example of what that looks like, if you look over the last, we looked at the last 14 years in the coverage of Uyghurs and Falun Gong, there are 27 op-eds in the New York Times about Uyghurs. I think 7 or 10 of those were penned by Uyghurs themselves. For the last 25 years, there's not been a single op-ed in the New York Times by a Falun Gong practitioner.
Wow, and given these 25 years, what was the conclusion of your 40-plus page report?
The conclusion is it's undeniable there is a Falun Gong exception within the New York Times. It's undeniable that there is a significant effort to distort the beliefs, the practices of the Falun Gong faith community. It is undeniable that there is a lack of coverage of horrible human rights abuses over 25 years, even as the major human rights groups, even our U.S. Department of State, every year is documenting human rights abuses against Falun Gong. So this is a catastrophic failure of international reporting on the New York Times. So the question is why? Now, that's not something we necessarily can answer. We're not in the back rooms of the New York Times. We don't understand all their dealings. We're not privy to that. But I think it's important to understand the demonstrable trend, not just for the Falun Gong community, but we rely on the New York Times and other papers to inform us about important things in the world. And if they're getting this story that wrong on Falun Gong, what might they else be getting wrong? And I think it's important for people to realize that, to recognize, okay, we need an answer to this question, because if we can't answer why the New York Times has done this to Falun Gong, how can we trust anything else that they report?
Kind of in a hypothetical, what would have happened if the New York Times from the very beginning was critical of the regime when it comes to the persecution of the Falun Gong?
It's a great question and a tough question to answer. We know from our human rights work on the ground for the last 25 years that attention works. When policemen that are holding practitioners, perhaps torturing them in a labor camp or a prison camp, when their crimes are exposed to the world, they get scared, they stop. Sometimes people are released. We know that works. So if more attention had been paid to this persecution, to not only reveal the persecution, but to sympathize with the victims, not paint them as some strange, unworthy victims, but to let the readers understand what is really the life of a Falun Gong practitioner inside China and the threat they live in. The real examples we've seen of people being their persecution lessened, the torturing stopped, sometimes being let out of prison, that could have been magnified. Who knows how many times, tens of times, hundreds of times, had the New York Times really brought to bear the full credibility and platform that they had to expose what's going on in Falun Gong, with Falun Gong in China. And I think it's almost impossible to measure that, but it is obvious it would have been significant in terms of saving an unlimited in terms of saving an enormous amount of suffering and perhaps even lives, not just for the people that are there, but for generations.
We did see instead the New York Times even saying that some of these practitioners said they had a better life in prison than back home, which would make people here in the West be like, oh, maybe it's not so bad. So that does sound like it would have been very different. Taking a step back here, what are you hoping the outcome will be following this report or, anything?
Well, just to speak personally for a second, the New York Times, perhaps like millions of families around America, that was a staple on of our family home. It was always on the dining room table growing up. And so that has always been an important reference for my family, for my community. So it is enormously disappointing and sad to see what has happened to Falun Gong. I think the most important thing now, or the thing we're hoping for, is we learn from this. If I was at the New York Times and this study came out, I hope there's some soul searching. Again, we can't say why that they're doing this, but the facts that the results that they achieve are in line with the goals of the largest, most tyrannical communist regime on earth should give the New York Times pause. What happened here? What is going on? That is what we're achieving. I hope it engenders some sort of soul searching and some change at the New York Times and other papers that might be suffering from the same kind of problem, looking at their operations, looking at what they're doing, looking at the spirit of what they're trying to achieve as the Fourth Estate and saying, we have a problem, let's fix it.
And what would be your message to those people who are finding out now through this report or through this interview that, the New York Times covered the Falun Gong wrong since the beginning? Where can they go if they want to learn about the Falun Gong?
Well, the first thing I would do is send them to our website. So the Falun Dafa Information Center website is faluninfo.net, which is FALUN info.net. There you're going to find an enormous amount of documentaries on the persecution, on what Falun Gong is. You're going to find reports. Again, we get every single day, we get a dozen reports from people inside China, all over China, documenting exactly what's happening in their neighborhood, in a prison camp down the road. We're getting that, we're analyzing it, we're publishing that. So I would go to that website, and that's where you're going to get the real story of what's happening to Falun Gong, certainly in China and around the world.
What an insightful conversation with Levi Browdy, Executive Director of Falun Dafa Information Center. Thank you for joining us for this special report. Please join me for China in Focus right here on NTD News. See you soon.
I've never seen a production any better than this, anywhere.
Breathtaking. It is absolutely stunning.
I feel better about the world. I feel uplifted.
Invigorating. It was encouraging. Gave me hope.
This has just been therapy for the soul.
It's a must-see. Must-see.
Make sure you see it. Make sure you see it.
Coming to Lincoln Center, April 3rd through the 14th. Buy tickets now at shenyun.com.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was was blind, but now I see.
They're just kids. Hungry, homeless, and vulnerable. Abused kids often feel safer on the street. Now, more than ever, that's the most dangerous place of all. Covenant House is rescuing and protecting kids during this COVID-19 crisis. We're providing safe shelter to thousands, but the need is overwhelming, and no child is ever turned away. Please call or go online now with your gift of $19 a month to help a homeless child. You'll provide safe shelter, hot meals, and medical care. Your gift will show our kids they're loved. Homeless kids are afraid and alone, with nowhere else to turn.
You want to know that there's somewhere you can go that's safe. So the Covenant House did that for us.
Please call now. With your gift of $19 a month, we'll send you this soft, comforting blanket to show you're helping our kids. Please don't wait. In our national crisis, your gift is the lifeline a child needs. Please call or go online to safeplacetosleep.org now. Thank you for saving precious lives.
Don't be screwed by lesser spine institutes who bait you with minimally invasive procedures. Then switch to screws, rods, disc replacements, and hardware. At Bonati, no metal hardware fusions are ever used. Bonati invented the precise tools necessary to minimize surgery, scarring, anesthesia, and recovery. So successful are the Bonati spine procedures, they consistently reflect 98.75% patient satisfaction. Over half our patients have suffered from failed back and neck surgeries at other facilities. Bonati succeeds where others fail.
It was spectacular, so beautiful.
I thought I was going to heaven.
Oh, it was electric.
I'm getting chills talking about it.
It gets a 10 from me, that's for sure.
It was that good.
Absolutely marvelous.
Hands down, the best show I've ever seen.
It's emotional, it's captivating, it's visual. Every single bit of your senses is engaged.
Oh my gosh, it was a riot. I didn't expect to laugh so much and also be touched so much.
I was really looking for something which was magical, uplifting, and it was way more than that.
The music was just so beautiful, and it really lit up the room.
There's nothing like live music.
The combination of the music and the dancing was sometimes uplifting. You know, my toes are tapping and I want to get out of my seat. But it was also very calming.
I think it's magnificent. It's magnificent to see another part of Chinese culture that a lot of people don't get to see. And the stories are amazing. The execution, the dance is amazing.
The flips, the aerial movement, it was amazing. It wasn't anything I've ever seen before.
Absolutely perfection. There wasn't even one flaw.
I must say I'm so highly impressed with the level of the dancers, their technique, just all the concepts are absolutely wonderful.
The costumes, they were works of art.
The way they used the costumes to create part of the image, it was just absolutely mind-blowing.
I thought I was going to come to see some amazing dancing, but I learned so much about the Chinese culture.
They're actually telling you the story of their life, of their culture, of their history, and bringing it full circle so that we can see and enjoy it.
There was an encouragement to go back to that divine nature and those divine values.
This experience for me is transcendent. It was a communication to the soul and the spirit.
And I cried, I think, the whole time because it was so amazing.
It was powerful, and it is something that's needed in today's society.
People nowadays go to the doctors, the psychiatrists for pills, for antidepressants. This is the antidepressant, the best.
I knew it was going to be good. It's a billion times better than I even thought it would be.
I've heard people say you don't want to miss this, and I would fully agree.
I'm going to tell everyone to come see it. You have to.
Definitely going to come back next year.
Totally inspirational. You have to go see this.